My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 30 years old, and for a long time, I believed my apartment was the one place in my life that was completely under my control. That belief cracked the night I noticed my couch cushions weren't where I left them. My bathroom smelled like shampoo I hadn't used, and food I clearly remembered buying was gone from my fridge. None of it screamed danger, and that was the problem. Everything looked normal enough to doubt myself to assume I was tired, distracted, careless. I work long hours. I come home late and I live alone, so forgetting small details felt like a reasonable explanation until it kept happening. The final push came when I opened my building's key fob app, something I rarely checked because I never needed to. My condo logs every entry automatically time-stamped precise, impossible to misread. As I scrolled, I saw access records that didn't line up with my schedule entries in the middle of afternoons and early evenings when I was nowhere near home. I didn't feel panicked. I felt alert in a way that's hard to explain, the kind of awareness that settles in when you realize a boundary has already been crossed and you're late to noticing it. I knew exactly where the access came from, because months earlier I'd handed my brother a spare fob meant strictly for emergencies, the kind you don't expect to actually happen. Somewhere along the way, that understanding shifted without my permission, and now I was sitting on my couch, staring at entry logs, trying to figure out how often my apartment had been treated like shared space without anyone bothering to tell me. Once someone decides your home is also theirs, the hardest part isn't stopping them. It's realizing they never asked in the first place. If you've ever had a family member blur a boundary and act like you were the unreasonable one for noticing, make sure you're subscribed. This situation didn't escalate overnight, and it definitely didn't stay quiet for long. By the time I locked my phone and looked around my apartment again, I wasn't asking if it was happening anymore. I was trying to understand how far it had already gone and what they thought they were allowed to do next. Not long after that, the situation stopped feeling like a coincidence and started behaving like a routine. I would leave my condo in the morning and come back to a space that had clearly been used, not vandalized or trashed, just occupied in a way that erased the assumption I was the only one who lived there. It wasn't subtle enough to dismiss and not dramatic enough to confront outright, which made it harder to name. Ethan Brooks. My older brother had begun bringing his 3 children into the building whenever it worked for him, and he did it when he knew I wouldn't be around to say anything. The visits had a pattern: mid-afternoon arrivals, short stops that stretched longer than intended exits that spilled into shared spaces instead of staying contained inside my unit. The kids ran through the hallway laughing, leaned against doors, pressed elevator buttons repeatedly, and sat on the lobby floor while Ethan stepped aside to take calls, and none of it stayed invisible. Our building isn't private once you step outside the unit, and that's where things started to shift. I noticed it first in the elevator, the way neighbors paused their conversations when I walked in, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, the brief looks that lingered just long enough to register recognition. Then came the email from building management, written carefully professionally, reminding me of guest access guidelines, hallway, noise, expectations, and the responsibility residents carry for repeated entries linked to their unit. No accusations, no warnings, just a clear record that my address was now associated with activity that didn't match the building's standards. I read the message more than once, feeling that slow tightening in my chest that comes when you realize you're being evaluated without having a voice in the process. In a place like this, it doesn't matter who causes the issue, it matters whose name is attached to the door. After that, the building felt different. Passing neighbors avoided eye contact or offered clipped greetings, the kind that signal distance rather than friendliness. One woman held the door open for the kids and then stepped back, as if she didn't want to be pulled into anything. Another resident glanced at me in the mailroom and looked away quickly, like he'd already made up his mind about what kind of tenant I was. None of it was overt, and that was the worst part. Because there was nothing concrete to defend myself against, only the growing sense that my reputation in this building was changing without my consent. I started adjusting my habits without fully realizing it, coming home earlier, leaving later, listening more carefully in common areas, calculating how every sound might be interpreted if it carried past my door. When I finally brought it up to Ethan, he brushed it off easily, said the kids were just restless, said the building was too strict, said nothing had been broken, so it wasn't a real problem. What he didn't see was that I was the one absorbing the consequences. He didn't get the emails, he didn't feel the social shift, and he didn't carry the quiet anxiety of knowing that my home, the place that was supposed to be stable, was starting to feel like a liability. Over time, the discomfort stopped being about inconvenience and started feeling structural, like something essential had been compromised. It wasn't just that my space was being used, it was that my ability to exist comfortably within it was shrinking, shaped by other people's decisions and assumptions, and the longer it continued, the clearer it became that waiting it out wasn't going to fix anything. The first real confrontation didn't come from anger, it came from exhaustion, the kind that makes avoidance feel dishonest. I called Ethan one evening when I knew the kids were already settled, expecting resistance, but hoping for clarity, and he answered in the same relaxed tone he always used, like nothing between us had shifted. I told him plainly that I needed him to stop coming into my condo without asking, that bringing the kids over when I wasn't home crossed a line, and that whatever arrangement he thought existed no longer did. I didn't raise my voice or stack complaints. I focused on what needed to change and why it mattered to me. He listened without interrupting at first, then let out a short breath and said, I was making it sound more serious than it was, that he was just using the space briefly, that the kids needed somewhere to be, and that he assumed I understood. The word assumed landed wrong, but I kept going, explaining that understanding wasn't the same as consent, and that my space wasn't available by default. His response shifted from casual to defensive in a way that felt familiar, like he was already preparing to justify himself rather than hear me. He talked about schedules, about how complicated things get when you have children, about flexibility being necessary once your life isn't just your own, and he framed my request as a lack of empathy rather than a boundary. I told him I wasn't asking him to simplify his life. I was asking him to respect mine, and that the issue wasn't the kids. It was the expectation that my home could be used without my input. He laughed quietly, not mocking, just dismissive, and said, I was being too rigid, that families don't operate on permission slips, and that it felt strange to have to ask his own sister to step into a space she wasn't using at the time. That was when he said it directly. No hesitation, that family isn't the same as strangers, that you don't treat people you're related to like outsiders, and that drawing lines like this only creates distance where there doesn't need to be any. I let him finish before responding because I wanted to understand exactly how he saw it, and when I spoke again, I told him that being related doesn't erase the need for respect, and that shared doesn't mean unlimited. He countered by saying nothing bad had happened, that no one was hurt, that the building rules were overblown, and that it wasn't worth turning something practical into a personal issue. I pointed out that the consequences were already real, that my name was attached to situations I wasn't present for, and that I was the one absorbing the discomfort while he moved on unaffected. He brushed past that, saying things would settle on their own, that people complain about everything these days, and that I was letting something small threaten our relationship. That was the moment I realized we weren't talking about logistics anymore. We were talking about entitlement disguised as closeness. To him, access was implied by family. To me, it was something that had to be offered, not assumed. The conversation ended without a solution. Neither of us yelling, neither of us apologizing, both of us holding our ground in different ways. After we hung up, the quiet felt heavier than the argument itself, and I found myself replaying his words, especially the idea that boundaries turn family into strangers. I couldn't tell if standing firm meant protecting something essential, or if I was slowly becoming the difficult one in his version of the story, the sister who cared more about control than connection. The problem was that from where I stood asking to be asked didn't feel like distance. It felt like basic consideration, and yet the more I insisted on it, the more I wondered whether everyone else would see it the same way. What finally pushed me to act wasn't anger. It was the realization that nothing would change on its own. The morning after the conversation, I contacted building management and asked to review the active access credentials connected to my unit, keeping the request brief and procedural because emotions weren't relevant to what I needed done. I explained that a spare key fob had been issued for temporary use, that the circumstances had changed, and that the access was now being used without authorization. The manager responded without hesitation, outlining the policy clearly and confirming that residents maintain full control over who can enter their unit regardless of personal relationships. There were no questions about motives, no suggestions to resolve it privately, just a straightforward process that treated this as what it was, a security matter. I completed the required form, verified my identity, and approved the deactivation request, and within minutes an automated confirmation appeared in my inbox stating that the secondary fob had been disabled effective immediately. I didn't notify Ethan beforehand. I didn't leave an explanation or a warning because I had already drawn the boundary verbally, and repeating myself would only invite another debate. This wasn't a confrontation, it was an adjustment. Once the access was revoked, the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. My entry records returned to a pattern that made sense. My phone stopped feeling like something I needed to check constantly, and the background tension I had been carrying eased in a way I hadn't realized was possible. The building itself felt neutral again, not watchful or charged, just a place where I lived. I passed through the lobby later that day and exchanged a polite nod with the staff member who had processed the request, and she treated it like routine because for her, it was. People change access permissions all the time, when relationships end, when arrangements expire, when circumstances shift. The only reason this felt heavy was because I had been taught to treat family access as unquestionable. Even when it created consequences, I was expected to absorb silently. Back inside my condo, the quiet felt different, not empty, but settled, like the space had finally realigned with its purpose. I didn't feel victorious or relieved in any dramatic sense. What I felt was steady, grounded in the knowledge that my actions matched the responsibility attached to my name on the lease. I understood that Ethan would eventually discover the change, that confusion would turn into irritation, and irritation into another conversation I wasn't prepared to revisit yet, but anticipating his reaction wasn't part of the decision. The goal wasn't to teach a lesson or make a point. It was to restore control over a situation that had drifted too far without my consent. I didn't view the move as cutting him off because I hadn't closed the door to communication or support or future arrangements made with mutual agreement. I had simply removed unrestricted access to a space that carried legal, social, and personal consequences for me alone. If that choice was interpreted as cold or inflexible, that interpretation would exist whether I acted or not. At least now the structure around me reflected the boundary I had already tried to explain, and for the first time since this started, my home felt like a place that responded to my decisions instead of someone else's assumptions. The reaction didn't arrive quietly, it arrived all at once. My phone started lighting up before noon with missed calls from Ethan, close together enough to feel intentional rather than accidental. And when I didn't answer, the messages followed abrupt questions, turning quickly into demands about why the fob wasn't working and whether I had changed something without telling him. Not long after that, my mother called, her voice tight with urgency, saying Ethan was outside my building with the kids, and that this wasn't the moment to draw lines or prove a point. I didn't argue or explain. I told her I was unavailable and ended the call before it could turn into a negotiation. Later, needing to understand what was happening without stepping into it, I opened the resident camera feed, the one meant for security awareness rather than curiosity, and watched as the situation unfolded in real time. Ethan stood in the lobby with all three children, clearly expecting the door to open, the way it always had, his posture shifting from confident to confused when it didn't. He paced near the elevator bank, swiping the fob again, glancing toward the desk as if waiting for someone to intervene on his behalf. When the security officer approached, the exchange stayed calm but firm. Ethan was asked to confirm resident access, and when he named me, the officer explained that without active authorization, guests couldn't remain inside the building. Ethan gestured toward the kids, his frustration becoming visible as he tried to frame the situation through them, pointing out their backpacks, their tired faces, insisting they wouldn't be long. The explanation didn't change. Policy was policy, and the officer repeated the request to step outside if entry couldn't be verified. The children grew restless as minutes passed, one leaning against a chair with half-closed eyes, another tugging at Ethan's arm, asking when they could go inside, the youngest starting to cry in a way that echoed through the open space and drew glances from people passing through. Residents slowed as they walked by, curiosity mixed with discomfort on their faces, the scene easy to misread at a glance. A father stranded with exhausted kids, blocked from a building he clearly believed he belonged in. Ethan's movements became sharper, his voice lower and more strained as he spoke into his phone, likely to my mother, likely describing the situation in terms that made me the obvious villain. The security officer remained steady, neither escalating nor backing down, and eventually Ethan gathered the kids together, ushering them toward the exit with hurried gestures, his embarrassment visible in the way he avoided looking at anyone as they left. Watching from a distance, I felt the pull of conflicting instincts, at once sympathy for the kids, who had no context for what was happening, discomfort at knowing how harsh the situation looked from the outside, and a quieter clarity that stepping in now would have rewritten the entire moment. I didn't go downstairs. I didn't signal to the desk or send a message to smooth things over, because doing so would have turned the boundary into a temporary inconvenience instead of a real limit. From the outside, it was easy to frame what was happening as cruelty rather than consequence, to see a closed door and assume malice rather than necessity. I was aware of how it could be told later, how the image of tired children waiting would carry more emotional weight than any explanation I could offer, and how restraint rarely looks compassionate in the moment it's practiced. Ethan called again that evening, his message sharp with accusation, saying the kids were upset, saying he'd been treated like a problem, saying I'd embarrassed him by making him look like he didn't belong. I listened without responding, not because I lacked empathy, but because responding would have meant undoing the very clarity I had fought to establish. What became clear to me then was that panic always demands immediate relief, while boundaries ask people to sit with discomfort, and from the outside, the difference between protection and punishment depends entirely on which side of the locked door you're standing on. The realization arrived without drama, the kind that settles in after the noise fades. Cutting off access had stopped the immediate intrusion, but it hadn't changed the underlying expectation that my space could be negotiated if enough pressure was applied, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. Even with the key fob disabled, I could already see how the next phase would unfold: new requests, framed as exceptions, emergencies, softened by guilt conversations looping back to the same argument in different packaging. Staying would mean constantly defending a decision that had already been made, and that wasn't protection, it was maintenance. So instead of preparing another explanation, I started preparing a move. I kept it practical and quiet, searching for condos in a different part of the same city, far enough to break patterns but close enough to keep my routines intact. Prioritizing buildings with stricter access protocols and layouts that didn't encourage casual visits. I scheduled viewings during hours that wouldn't attract attention, took notes, asked questions about security and guest policies, and left without discussing my reasons. Silence became a tool not out of fear, but because I understood how quickly information turned into leverage once it entered the family sphere. The moment anyone knew I was considering a move, it would become a group discussion, then a debate, then a referendum on my character, and I wasn't interested in negotiating my own living situation again. Each step forward felt measured rather than rushed, reviewing lease terms, confirming timelines, setting move-in dates that aligned cleanly without overlap. I handled paperwork through personal channels, arranged utilities under my name alone, and kept the process compartmentalized in a way that left no openings for interference. Packing followed the same logic. I didn't announce it or make visible changes that would raise questions. I started with things that carried no emotional weight: documents, off-season clothes, duplicates. I wouldn't miss, reducing my footprint gradually so the space looked normal even as it emptied. I coordinated with a moving service using a flexible weekday window, choosing a time when the building would be quieter and less social, minimizing the chance of unsolicited conversations. At no point did I frame the move as an escape or a punishment. It wasn't about disappearing or making a statement, it was about changing the conditions that had allowed entitlement to grow unchecked. I understood that leaving without explanation could be read as avoidance, but explaining had already proven ineffective, and I wasn't interested in repeating a cycle that always ended the same way. The closer the move became, the calmer I felt, like I had shifted from reacting to anticipating, from defending to designing. I wasn't cutting anyone out of my life. I was removing proximity as a pressure point. The city stayed the same. My work stayed the same. Even my routines stayed mostly intact. But the distance created something I hadn't had before: a buffer that didn't require constant enforcement. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't justify the decision in advance, because justification had become an invitation rather than a boundary. What I did instead was align my actions with what I already knew: that privacy only works when it's structural, not symbolic. By the time the lease was signed and the move scheduled, the decision no longer felt heavy or secretive, it felt settled. For the first time since this began, the outcome didn't depend on anyone else understanding, agreeing, or approving. It depended on execution, and that clarity made the plan feel not just necessary, but inevitable. The move itself was brief, deliberate, and final. Everything was done in one pass one morning, with no staggered trips and no visible buildup, because I understood that visibility invites intervention. By the time the sun was fully up, my belongings were gone, the unit was empty, and my connection to that address had been severed in every practical sense. The lease closed, utilities transferred, forwarding disabled. I didn't leave an explanation behind or share a new location with anyone who might feel entitled to it. When Ethan realized I had moved, the reaction unfolded slowly rather than dramatically. Confusion first, then irritation, then the quiet frustration that comes when familiar shortcuts stop working. He tried calling repeatedly, then texting, then asking our mother if she knew where I was, but there was nothing for her to give him beyond the fact that I was no longer accessible in the way he was used to. The option of showing up disappeared entirely, and with it the ability to turn inconvenience into urgency. What followed wasn't a single crisis, but a string of small, persistent adjustments that didn't resolve themselves. Without my place as a fallback, Ethan had to reconfigure his work schedule, taking shifts that fit around school hours, instead of convenience declining flexibility he once assumed was available. When schedules clashed, he paid for childcare he hadn't planned, on last-minute arrangements that cost more, and offered less reliability expenses that didn't feel dramatic individually, but accumulated week after week. He vented to our mother about how complicated things had become, about how much harder it was without support nearby. But the tone changed over time. The familiar pressure tactics lost momentum once there was no address to aim them at. Telling me to be reasonable didn't carry weight when reason no longer included access. Suggesting compromises didn't work when proximity was no longer negotiable. Gradually, frustration gave way to adaptation. Ethan adjusted carpools, coordinated with coworkers, and accepted constraints he had previously avoided by leaning on my space. None of it ruined his life, and that was precisely the point. The consequences weren't catastrophic, they were structural. They reshaped routines instead of creating a single dramatic fallout. Our mother attempted a few more times to intervene, her calls framed as concern rather than demand, asking whether I could at least share my address for emergencies, suggesting that distance wasn't how families were meant to function. But without a physical endpoint to apply pressure to, the conversation stayed contained. I responded selectively, sharing updates on my terms, staying present in ways that didn't reopen the door that had already been closed. Over time, the family system recalibrated without my involvement. The assumption of availability dissolved. Planning replaced improvisation. Requests became explicit instead of implied. From my side, the shift felt steady rather than triumphant. Days passed without unexpected calls or last-minute needs. Weeks went by without the low-grade vigilance that had become normal before. The distance didn't erase relationships, but it removed immediacy as a tool, forcing interactions to exist within limits, rather than convenience. What lingered wasn't resentment or relief, but a sustained change in how responsibility was distributed. Ethan carried the weight of his own logistics. Our mother learned that concern didn't translate into control when access was no longer guaranteed. And I learned that the cost of reclaiming space isn't paid in a single confrontation. It's paid over time through the quiet persistence of boundaries that don't need to be defended once the conditions around them have changed. The new condo didn't announce itself as a fresh start. It simply allowed me to exist without being watched or waited on, and that absence of pressure changed everything faster than I expected. Days moved without interruption, the kind that don't leave a mark because nothing goes wrong, and I stopped bracing for the sound of my phone or the idea that someone else might be counting on my availability. I unpacked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because there was no urgency anymore, nothing chasing me forward or pulling me back. The building had rules that were followed without explanation, neighbors who nodded and kept moving, a quiet that felt structural rather than emotional. I didn't announce where I was, and I didn't hide it either. I just didn't offer it, and that distinction mattered more than I'd ever admitted before. Weeks passed like that, long enough for the tension I'd carried to lose its shape, until one evening a message came through from Ethan, a single line that landed without force and without warmth, asking where I was now and whether we could talk. There was no apology folded into it. No accusation either, just a careful neutrality that suggested he'd finally understood the limits of pushing, even if he still expected access to the explanation. I read it once, then set the phone down, not because I needed time to decide, but because the decision had already been made long before the message arrived. Responding would have reopened a channel that had taken deliberate effort to close, and silence at that point wasn't avoidance, it was maintenance. I let the message sit unanswered, and nothing followed it. No escalation, no rerouting through someone else, no pressure disguised as concern. The quiet that came afterward didn't feel empty. It felt complete, like a door that had been shut carefully instead of slammed. My routines continued, uninterrupted, mornings unfolding without checking who might need something, evenings ending without calculating whether peace would last. I noticed how much energy I'd once spent anticipating reactions, managing expectations that were never mine to fulfill, and how little effort life required once that role was removed. From time to time, I wondered what the silence looked like from the outside, whether it read as cruelty or indifference, and I accepted that I wouldn't be there to correct the narrative. I had already explained myself more than once, already tried to translate boundaries into language that could be ignored or reframed, And stepping away from that cycle was the only thing that had actually worked. The distance didn't erase family ties, it simply stripped them of leverage, leaving them intact, but inactive, unable to override consent. There was no dramatic fallout, no moment where everything resolved itself cleanly, just a steady continuation of days that no longer revolved around someone else's access to my space or my time. I didn't block numbers or issue final statements I didn't need to, because the lack of response had become its own condition clear enough to stand without reinforcement. Whatever adjustments happened on Ethan's side unfolded without my involvement, and for the first time that separation didn't feel like loss. It felt like proportion. My life narrowed into something manageable, not smaller, just contained, and in that containment there was rest. No lessons were delivered, no forgiveness demanded or denied, just the understanding that some endings don't arrive with confrontation or closure. They arrive when you stop answering and allow the quiet to do what explanations never could. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.